People often say that money cannot buy happiness. But when we have a stable income, we usually feel more at ease, and life also becomes much smoother in many ways. In reality, it is not because money can buy joy, but because it helps us feel less pressure, less anxiety, and less fear when unexpected events happen in life. But the question here is, how much money does a person need to feel safe enough and truly at peace? That is also exactly what today's video wants to share with you. Together, we will explore how much money each generation really needs to be happy, and why that number can vary so surprisingly through the story of a guy named Bobo. What people really want. This morning, Bobo walked into a bakery with $20 in his hand. He only thought he would buy a few loaves of bread for the next few meals, grab a carton of milk, and then head home. But standing in front of the counter, Bobo realized that amount of money was not enough for him to buy everything he needed. If he got enough bread, he would have to put the milk back. If he kept the milk, he would have to give up one loaf of bread. And if he wanted to keep a few dollars for gas or in case something urgent came up, then the supplies he needed to buy would be reduced even more. Even though they were only a few very ordinary items, Bobo still had to stand there doing the math over and over again. That was when Bobo understood that what he lacked was not just money. What he needed was enough money to buy the essentials, without having to worry that right after that, he would not have enough left for something else. And if something unexpected happened today or tomorrow, he would still have money to handle it. And that is also what a lot of people are looking for. People do not necessarily want a huge amount of money to live a luxurious life. What they usually want is simply enough food in the house, bills paid on time, and a little money still left in their hands so they can feel more at ease with life. When you look at money that way, you will see that what people are chasing is often not just money itself. What they truly want is the sense of stability that money can bring. How much money each generation needs to be happy. Number 1. The generation that grew up during the Great Depression, 1901 to 1945. Over the weekend, Bobo stopped by to visit his grandfather, and he saw him carefully fixing an old wooden chair that had been worn down by the years, but he still would not throw it away. He tightened every screw, sanded every chipped spot, and tried to make it last as long as possible. On the corner of the table next to him, his grandfather had also carefully smoothed out used wrapping paper and folded it neatly to save for next time. They were only small things, but the way he did them made Bobo realize that his grandfather valued every item, as if everything had its own worth. Because in Bobo's eyes, his grandfather was no longer living in hardship. He had a house to live in, a pension, food in the kitchen, and overall, a fairly stable life. And yet, he still kept the habit of saving every little bit, still repaired old things, and still held on to items that many younger people would casually throw away. That was when Bobo understood that the way his grandfather saw the value of money and the value of life was very different from his own. That was because his grandfather's generation had lived through years when going without was an everyday reality. Back then, there was not always food waiting in the kitchen. Buying something new was not easy either. If something broke, it had to be fixed. If something could still be used, it had to be kept. No one dared to waste anything, because no one knew whether tomorrow there would still be enough money or enough goods to buy. For someone who had lived through a time like that, the feeling of not having enough was not just a story they had heard. It was something they had truly experienced. That is why this older generation's standard for a peaceful life is also very different. They do not need the newest things or a flashy lifestyle to feel happy. What makes them happy is usually just the basics, like a roof that is still solid and does not leak in the rain, bills that can still be paid on time, a small amount of money still in hand in case of illness or an unexpected situation. For them, that is already enough to feel relieved. The same amount of money that might still make Bobo feel uneasy could be enough for his grandfather to feel at peace. The difference does not lie entirely in the number itself, but in what each person has lived through, and it is that past that shapes how they define what is enough and what happiness means. Number 2. The Baby Boomers, 1946 to 1964. Unlike his grandfather's generation, which lived through real hardship, Bobo's parents belonged to the baby boomer generation and lived much more comfortably, because in their time, the path to a financially stable life was usually much easier to follow. When Bobo's parents were young, just having a stable job was enough for them to start thinking about buying a house, buying a car, getting married, and raising children. Of course, those things still took effort, but they were not too far out of reach. A person who worked hard for many years could usually see clearly how their life was moving forward step by step. For example, after working for a long time, they could begin to save up a large amount of money. Once they had savings, they could start thinking about buying a house. After owning a home, they could move on to raising children and preparing for old age. Now, looking back at his parents' life, Bobo suddenly realized that back then, everything seemed much more within reach and much easier to manage than it is now. At that time, his parents were able to buy their first house while they were still fairly young through their own hard work. Each month, their income did not rise by very much, but it was still enough to fully cover household expenses, support their children's education, pay all the necessary bills, and still leave something extra to save for the future. Because of that, the baby boomers' definition of happiness was simply having a good life, having a home of their own, a reliable way to get around, a monthly income that covered expenses, children who were raised properly, and then in old age, having enough retirement money to live comfortably without too much worry, because in their time, those important goals were genuinely closer and easier to reach. When home prices had not yet skyrocketed and the cost of living was still relatively manageable, one stable job could bring a very clear sense of security. They did not need to dream about some massive amount of money to deal with uncertainty, because the ground beneath their feet used to feel solid. If Bobo's grandfather's generation needed less material comfort because they knew what real lack felt like, then the baby boomers needed less material comfort because they lived in a time when, as long as you stayed on the expected path, life would almost certainly turn out stable. The happiness number they gave was usually much lower than Bobo's, simply because their path to peace of mind was shorter, clearer, and far easier to reach than it is in today's reality. Number 3. Generation X, 1965 to 1980. After leaving behind his parents' generation and that golden era that had already passed, Bobo turned his attention to another generation to better understand how much money they really needed to buy that feeling of happiness. That generation was Gen X. Bobo tried putting himself in their shoes and realized that for Gen X, the $20 loaf of bread he bought would not be just for them alone. If Bobo were Gen X, the moment he held that loaf of bread in his hands, he would have to start dividing it up. He would have to break off a large piece for his aging parents, whose health was declining and who needed medical care. He would have to set aside another portion for his children's education because tuition was no longer cheap like it used to be. Then he would have to cut off yet another piece to pay for long-term home and car loans. In the end, the part of the bread left for Bobo himself would not be much at all. That is exactly why this generation's idea of what feels like enough began to grow so much bigger. They are stuck in the middle of two fronts. On one side, they have to take care of the past, meaning their parents. On the other side, they have to take care of their children's future. Bobo understood that in Gen X's position, he could not feel secure with just an ordinary job, because all it takes is one small disruption, like a loved one getting sick or a round of layoffs, and that loaf of bread, already so limited, would no longer be enough to feed everyone. Because of that, the number they need in order to feel happy rises much higher than it did for the generations before them. They need more money not because they are greedy, but because their safety net is now carrying far too much weight. For them, enough means enough to protect all the people they love. Peace of mind becomes incredibly expensive at that point because happiness is now tied to one word: responsibility. Number 4. Millennials, 1981 to 1996. Now that he understood the burden carried by the generations before him, Bobo turned back to look at himself and the friends around his age. He realized that while his grandfather's generation and his parents' generation had a relatively clear path, Bobo was walking on a road that was steep, slippery, and covered in fog. People often say that Bobo's generation is slow to grow up, but the truth is not that simple. Looking back at Bobo's $20 loaf of bread, if in his parents' time one loaf of bread only took a small amount of labor to earn, now Bobo has to work many times harder just to get that same value. The most basic things needed to build a stable life, like a home or a college degree, have gone up in price at an explosive rate. While wage growth has moved as slowly as a turtle, Bobo feels like he is running on a treadmill. He is still trying his best, still sweating every day, but the distance to the finish line does not seem to get any shorter. To have the kind of stable life his parents once had, meaning a place of his own and financial freedom, Bobo has to earn a very large amount of money. Not because he is overly ambitious or chasing some fantasy, but because the price tag attached to peace of mind in his era has been pushed far too high. Because the road ahead is so uncertain, Bobo has no choice but to live in a defensive mindset. He needs more money saved up because he does not know when the economy will start shaking again or when his job might be replaced. That is why the happiness number for Bobo's generation shoots up the highest, because they are trying to build a fortress strong enough to withstand a world that is changing far too fast. For Bobo at this point, happiness means having enough resources to make sure he never ends up with nothing when an economic storm suddenly hits. Number 5. Generation Z, 1997 to 2012. Continuing the journey to Gen Z, Bobo was truly stunned. If for the earlier generations, the happiness number rose gradually because of growing responsibilities and rising costs, then with Gen Z, the number they give for feeling happy is often shockingly high. And yet, when Bobo sat down calmly and put himself in their position, he realized that behind that enormous number was a deep sense of insecurity, because Gen Z feels like they are not standing on solid ground at all. Just imagine Bobo's $20 loaf of bread. For a young person in Gen Z, that loaf of bread is not only supposed to fill their stomach, it also has to carry the pressure of invisible standards coming from the screen of a phone. They grew up in a flat world, where every time they scroll through social media, they are surrounded by images of dazzling success and luxurious trips taken by people their own age. That unintentionally creates a new measure of happiness. It is not enough to have enough to eat. They also feel they need to look good enough and have enough experiences so they do not feel left behind in the race of the modern world. But while the standard for happiness has been pushed sky high, the reality under their feet is more unstable than ever. Gen Z is stepping into adulthood at a time when technology is changing at lightning speed, traditional careers are being shaken, and global disruptions happen all the time. For them, the idea of having one stable job for several decades feels almost impossible. They do not have that flat ground that earlier generations had, things like retirement security or the relative ease of owning a home. Because the world feels so fragile and breakable, Gen Z gives such a massive number as a way of buying insurance for the future. They want a lot of money right now, because they no longer believe in the idea of long-term stability. For them, happiness has to be a number large enough that even if the world turns upside down, even if technology replaces people, they still have a life raft strong enough to let them live freely on their own terms. That shocking number is, in reality, the voice of a generation trying to find safety in an era where nothing feels certain. Number 6. Generation Alpha. After reflecting on all the ups and downs of the generations before him, Bobo began thinking about the future of his own children one day, Generation Alpha. He asked himself, if his grandfather used money to secure survival, his parents used money to build stability, and he used money to buy safety against uncertainty, then how much would his children need in order to reach happiness? Bobo realized that for Generation Alpha, the idea of what it means to have enough would go even further, into a world where value itself seems more abstract and endless than ever. He imagined that by the time his children grow up, that $20 loaf of bread might no longer even be a physical item sitting on a supermarket shelf. His children would be born into a world where the line between what is real and what is virtual has grown increasingly blurry, where happiness may sometimes be tied to digital experiences, social standing in online spaces, or access to the most advanced technologies, so they do not fall behind. And by the time money reaches that generation, it may no longer be paper bills sitting in a wallet, because by then it will have become more like a vital form of energy needed to keep life running. In a future where the speed of change is measured in seconds, the ground beneath that generation's feet will keep shifting shape without ever standing still. The number that makes this generation feel secure will probably be enormous, because that is the price of buying freedom and complete adaptability in a world with no pause button. At that moment, Bobo suddenly understood that from his grandfather's time to the generation of his future children, the amount of money needed to buy peace of mind and happiness keeps growing as the world changes. That is because the cost of maintaining a peaceful life keeps becoming more and more expensive. The more modern the world becomes, the more people have to equip themselves with bigger and bigger life rafts so they do not get swallowed by an ocean of constant upheaval. So in the end, the human need for happiness, no matter the era, is still essentially the search for a sense of safety in an unpredictable life. The number needed to feel happy keeps increasing with each generation, not because people are becoming greedier. That number rises because the world keeps getting more expensive and more complicated, so the cost of stability rises along with it. When all is said and done, money and numbers only serve as tools that help each person buy freedom, freedom from anxiety, and freedom to live life on their own terms. Happiness, rather than being some absolute number, is really a state of balance. Once we understand that, we can free ourselves from the endless cycle of comparison and the fear of the future.